Hi, I'm Sienna Cole. For years, I believed silence was love. That if I kept fixing, paying, covering, maybe one day my parents would finally see me. Then the bank called, $99,000. My name on a wedding I didn't plan. For a brother I never chose. When I refused to pay, they called me ungrateful, told me family comes first. But I've learned family isn't blood, it's boundaries. I didn't scream, didn't beg, I started keeping receipts. And by the time the roses were delivered, the fire had already started, and they never saw me strike the match. My name is Sienna Cole. I am 40 years old, and if you asked anyone around me, they'd tell you my life looks ordinary, almost boring. I wake early, grind the same coffee beans, lace my shoes for a jog through quiet Houston streets, then return to a modest apartment where everything has its place. I like things in order, the mugs aligned by size, the bills paid on time, the passwords changed every 90 days. My job in cybersecurity trained me to anticipate breaches before they happen, and maybe that's why I cling to routines. Routines don't betray you. They keep the world predictable, steady. That Sunday morning was no different. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that makes the grass glisten even though it hasn't rained. I was mowing the patchy lawn outside my building when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I nearly ignored it, but then I saw the name, Mom, Lorraine Cole. Her voice poured through the line too sweet, like syrup over something spoiled. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her tone bright enough to feel rehearsed. "I didn't wake you, did I?" I pressed the mower's handle down to stop the engine, the sudden silence ringing in my ears. "No, Mom. Everything okay?" "Oh, nothing serious," she laughed lightly, the sound brittle. "Just a little hiccup. You know how banks are these days. Your father and I ran into a small snag, and I was wondering, just for a few days, could we put something on your credit card? We'll pay it right back, of course. It's really nothing." My grip tightened on the phone. The words, "just for a few days," carried the weight of a lifetime. I had heard that phrase before, in different tones, in different seasons, but it always meant the same thing. My resources, not theirs. "What kind of snag?" I asked carefully, though I already knew the answer wouldn't be clear. "Oh, nothing dramatic," she said quickly, smoothing her voice like pressed silk. "Just a deposit that couldn't wait. You've always been so reliable, Sienna, always the one we can trust. Family takes care of family, right?" That line, always that line. Family takes care of family, which in our house meant you sacrifice and we take. I stood in the still street staring at the neat rows of parked cars, feeling the old reflex rise in me. The reflex to agree, to smooth things over, to earn love by saying yes. "Just a few days," I repeated, though my gut told me it was a lie. "Promise," she said quickly. "And thank you, sweetheart. We love you." By the time I hung up, the mower's engine still smelled of fuel, but the air felt heavier, like I had handed over more than plastic. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the card in my wallet. It was still mine, embossed with my name, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. My apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about how easy it was for them to ask, how natural it felt for them to assume I'd say yes. And I thought about how long that pattern had been running. When I was 17, there was another small hiccup. My father had injured his back and needed surgery. Insurance covered part of it, but not all. I remember sitting at the dining room table, a pen pressed into my hand, my mother's voice soft but firm. "It's just a formality, sweetheart. We need you to co-sign this loan. You'll barely notice." I was still in high school, still thinking about prom dresses and college applications. But that night, I became legally bound to debt I didn't understand. No one explained the numbers to me. They just smiled when I signed, as though I'd proven I was a good daughter. That memory surfaced now, uninvited, like an old wound reopening. Back then I thought it was love, that my willingness to help meant I belonged. But sitting in my quiet apartment at 40, I finally understood. It wasn't love, it was convenience. The credit card lay on the table under the dim light. I pressed my finger against the raised letters of my name, the letters they had always treated like theirs to use. I didn't know it yet, but that Sunday phone call was just the beginning. The breach had already started. That night, long after the sun had slipped behind the Houston skyline, I sat in my apartment with the credit card on the table. The small piece of plastic glimmered under the yellow light of my kitchen lamp, but to me it looked foreign, as if someone had swapped it for a stranger's. My name was still there, the embossed letters cold beneath my fingertips, but it no longer felt like mine. It felt like a leash, one my parents had fastened around my neck years ago, pulling tighter every time I thought I could breathe freely. The apartment was still, the kind of stillness that makes you hear the soft buzz of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the clock, the whisper of your own breath. I stared at the card until my eyes blurred, until I felt like I was staring at the story of my life pressed into 4 inches of plastic. I had been told I was dependable, reliable, trustworthy. Words meant to sound like praise, but in practice they meant I was a resource to be used. I booted up my laptop, maybe hoping distraction would dissolve the unease. But the unease had already grown teeth. My inbox was crowded with work emails, newsletters I never read, promotions I always deleted. Then I saw it, subject line, payment method on file confirmed. It was from Magnolia Ridge Estate, a name that meant nothing to me then. My stomach clenched as I opened it. Dear Ms. Cole, thank you for providing your credit information to secure your reservation. We are delighted to host your special occasion. Special occasion. My cursor hovered over the screen. I hadn't booked anything. I hadn't even heard of Magnolia Ridge. The email was polite, formal, complete with digital confetti along the header, as if I should be celebrating. Instead, I felt the bottom drop out of my chest. I leaned back, the chair creaking under me, and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes. This wasn't just a favour. This was planned. Someone had already given my name, my card, my trust away, like it was theirs to distribute. A dull memory tugged at me, and before I could push it aside, it surfaced whole. 20 years earlier, I was 20, freshly moved into my first apartment. I remember receiving a letter in the mail, addressed not to me, but still carrying my name. It was a past due notice for an electric bill from an address I didn't recognise. Confused, I brought it home to my parents. Lorraine smiled as if it were nothing. Oh, sweetheart, we just put it in your name years ago when we switched providers. It was easier. Don't worry about it. I didn't argue then. I was too young, too desperate to keep peace. But that small detail, forgotten until this moment, now sharpened into something undeniable. They had been using my name, my identity, as a tool long before today's credit card fiasco. The wedding deposit wasn't an accident. It was a continuation, a habit, a pattern so ingrained that they didn't even see it as theft anymore. I opened the old drawer where I kept stray papers, tax forms, expired insurance cards, dusty envelopes. Buried inside was that very notice, still folded, still marked final warning. I had kept it, not knowing why. Now, As I unfolded the fragile paper, the truth hit me like a blunt instrument. My parents had taught me from the beginning that my name was not mine to guard, it was theirs to spend. The room spun with the weight of it. I felt a rush of heat up my neck, a mix of shame and fury. All those years I believed silence meant loyalty, that swallowing my questions made me a better daughter. But what it really made me was convenient. They hadn't betrayed me once. They had been betraying me all along. I looked again at the glowing subject line in my inbox, the cheery words thanking me for an event I never chose. My chest tightened, breath catching sharp in my lungs. The card on the table wasn't just compromised, it was a symbol of my entire life in their hands. For the first time, I let myself whisper the truth out loud, though no one was there to hear it. They never saw me, they only used me. The words hung heavy in the quiet kitchen. And in that silence, I realized this wasn't the beginning of betrayal. It was the proof that betrayal had been the foundation all along. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon while I was at work. My phone lit up with an unfamiliar number, but something told me to answer. A crisp voice introduced herself as Kelsey Diaz from Gulfstar Bank. Ms. Cole, we just wanted to confirm a charge processed last week. $99,000 to Magnolia Ridge Estate. For a moment, I thought she had dialed the wrong person. 99,000? That was nearly 3 times my yearly rent. My mouth went dry. There must be a mistake, I said, forcing a laugh. No mistake, ma'am. It was processed under your line of credit, ending in... She recited the digits of my card with perfect clarity. My legs went numb. I thanked her mechanically, though my voice cracked and hung up. The room tilted around me. $99,000 wasn't a hiccup. It was theft. Not subtle, not small, but bold and entitled. My parents hadn't borrowed. They had taken. By the time I drove to their house, the sun was slipping low, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. The scent of cinnamon rolls hit me as soon as I stepped inside, a smell meant to soothe, to disguise the poison underneath. Lorraine was at the kitchen island, flipping through a catalogue of flowers, pen tapping cheerfully against the page. My father, Peter, leaned over a stack of guest lists, his glasses perched at the tip of his nose. "Hi, sweetheart," Lorraine said, as if nothing had happened. "We're thinking roses, maybe blush, maybe cream. What do you think?" I didn't sit down. "We need to talk." She waved a hand dismissively. "Let's get coffee first. You always think better after caffeine." "I'm not here for coffee. That money wasn't yours to spend." Her smile faltered only for a second before sliding back into place. "Sienna, don't be selfish. You knew this was important." "Selfish?" My voice rose sharper than I intended. "Yes," she said, lips tightening. "Adrian has no one else. You have your job, your place. He's starting a new life, building a family. You should be happy for him." I turned to my father. "You let this happen?" Peter sighed, as if I were an unruly child. "Don't make a scene. You're blowing this out of proportion." My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. $99,000 isn't proportion. It's my life, my name, my credit. Before either of them could reply, the front door opened. Adrian walked in, tall and confident. Tess just behind him, her arms full of colour swatches and binders. The room shifted instantly. Lorraine's face lit up like dawn. "There you are," she gushed, rushing to hug Tess as if she were royalty. "Look at you two, so perfect together." Adrian barely nodded at me, as if I were a stranger loitering in his house. He pulled out a chair at the table, and without asking, Tess spread her papers across the wood surface, talking about themes and seating charts. I stood there, awkward, invisible. No one invited me to sit. The cinnamon rolls, the catalogues, the laughter, all of it circled around Adrian like a crown. He was the golden sun, the miracle child they adored, and I was the inconvenient shadow in the corner. Then Tess glanced up, and for a flicker of a second, our eyes met. She didn't look startled or apologetic or even confused. She looked steady, sharp, like she already knew everything. There was no surprise in her expression, only recognition. It was in that look I understood. She wasn't innocent. She knew the money came from me. She knew, and she didn't care. The realization burned hotter than any words my parents had thrown at me. This wasn't just family entitlement. This was collusion. They had welcomed her into their circle, and together they had decided my silence was theirs to exploit. I stepped back, the floor creaking under my shoes, and no one turned. Not Adrian, not Lorraine, not Peter. Only Tess's eyes followed me for one last moment, calm, certain, complicit. In that instant, I knew I was outnumbered in my own bloodline. Dinner that evening was louder than usual, though none of the noise seemed to include me. Lorraine had set the table with her special china, the set reserved for holidays and milestones, though this was just another night of planning Adrian's wedding. Plates clattered, forks scraped. Tess's voice carried on about floral arches and lighting arrangements. I picked at the food in front of me, the famous meatloaf no one actually liked, but everyone pretended to. Halfway through, Peter stood up with a glass of wine in his hand. His voice boomed, practiced and proud. "I want to propose a toast," he said, eyes glistening as he turned to Adrian. "To the son who brought light into this family. Adrian, you've made us proud." The words hit like a hammer. The son who brought light. I froze, my fork hovering above the plate. No one glanced my way. Not Lorraine, not Tess, not Adrian, basking in the glow of the moment. The spotlight was his, and I wasn't even in the room. My chest tightened. The scene dragged me back years, to my high school graduation. I had worked nights, clawed through classes. No one thought I'd pass. I crossed the stage proud, expecting a moment of recognition. But when I opened the program later, my name was spelled wrong. Sienna Cole, missing the extra N. I had pointed it out, waiting for someone to laugh, to fix it, to care. No one had. They brushed it off. It's close enough. That was the theme of my childhood. Close enough to matter for utility. Never enough to matter for love. Back at the dinner table, my pulse thudded in my ears. I set my fork down deliberately and asked, "Do you even remember what college I went to?" The room went still. Lorraine blinked. Tess tilted her head, feigning curiosity. Finally, Lorraine said, "Wasn't it community college?" Her tone was dismissive, as if the detail hardly mattered. I nodded once. "Yeah, look at Adrian." My voice was steady, but inside it cracked. The silence stretched heavy across the table, broken only by the clinking of glasses. I pushed back my chair. "Thanks for dinner." No one stopped me as I stood. No one asked where I was going. The laughter resumed within seconds, swelling around Adrian like I'd never been there. Driving home, I kept the radio off, the windows cracked, letting the humid air rush in to fill the silence. By the time I parked, my hands were trembling so badly I had to grip the steering wheel to steady them. Inside, the apartment welcomed me with its stillness, but the peace I usually found there was gone. I dropped my keys on the counter and pulled out my phone. My thumb hesitated over the bank app, but dread wasn't enough to stop me anymore. I had to know. When the account loaded, my breath caught. The 99,000 wasn't an isolated hit. There were dozens of charges stacked one after another. Florist fees, tuxedo rentals, catering deposits, a private tasting dinner at some overpriced venue, invitations, chair rentals, everything that made a wedding extravagant, paid for by me, my name, my credit, my silence. My stomach churned. I scrolled faster, the numbers blurring together. Then one transaction stopped me cold, a payment memo that read, "Deposit, Tess Monroe." I blinked, reread, my heart hammering. Tess hadn't just benefited, she had used my card directly, bold enough to type her own name into the memo field, certain no one would challenge her. The room seemed to shrink around me. It wasn't just my parents, it wasn't just Adrian. Tess had her fingerprints on the theft too. That calm, knowing look she'd given me earlier wasn't just arrogance, it was ownership. I sat there staring at the glowing screen, my reflection pale in the glass. Every charge, every careless swipe, every assumption that I would stay silent piled higher until it pressed down on my chest. They hadn't just taken my money. They had written me out of their lives and repurposed my name as a blank check. And Tess, sweet, perfect Tess, had signed it herself. The next day at work, my focus was shattered before I even logged in. I sat at my desk in the open plan office, screen glowing with unread emails, but the numbers from my bank app haunted me. 99,000, florists, catering, Tess Monroe. It ran like static in my head, louder than the click of keyboards around me. Across the cubicle wall, Riley leaned over, her hair pulled into a messy bun, eyes narrowing at me. "You look like someone just watched a puppy get kicked," she said. I tried to smile, but it came out tired, brittle. "Rough week." "Family drama?" she guessed, as if it were the most obvious answer. I laughed once, more reflex than humour. "Something like that." She tilted her head, studying me the way only someone perceptive could. "Coffee after shift?" "My treat. I've got a gift card burning a hole in my wallet." Normally I'd decline, but the idea of sitting alone with my thoughts felt unbearable, so I nodded. We ended up in a corner booth of a coffee shop that smelled of burnt espresso and sugar. The place was half empty, quiet, except for the low hum of conversation and the clatter of mugs. I wrapped my hands around the paper cup, even though the coffee had already cooled. After a long silence, I said, "Let me ask you something weird. Hypothetically, if your family used your credit card to pay for something big, life-changing big, and didn't tell you, what would you do?" Riley raised an eyebrow. "What kind of big?" "Wedding." Her jaw dropped a little. "Wait, your wedding?" "My brother's." My voice was flat, drained. She leaned back, whistling low. "Damn, let me get this straight. They used your card without permission for a wedding that isn't yours?" I nodded once. "That's not family," she said, her voice sharp. "That's fraud with a hug." The words cut clean through me, sharper than any legal jargon, more piercing than any lecture I'd given myself. Fraud with a hug. That was exactly what it was, dressed up as love, coated in sweetness, but theft all the same. When I got home that evening, her words wouldn't leave me. They echoed through the silence of my apartment, each syllable a reminder that what had been done to me wasn't just careless. It was deliberate. It was criminal. I went to the closet and pulled out a battered cardboard box, one I hadn't opened in years. Inside were scraps of old life, photographs, bills, receipts. At the very bottom was a USB drive I'd labelled simply Family Ledger. I plugged it in, my heart pounding. The spreadsheet popped open on my screen, and there it was, rows and rows of dates, amounts, notes. I had started it years ago as a joke, a way to keep track of the IOUs that always went unpaid. Gas money, phone bills, favours that never balanced. But as the years passed, the entries grew heavier. 2017, Adrian's rehab copay, $800. 2018, Dad's new hearing aids, $1 ton, $600. 2019, Mum's broken AC unit, $4,300. 2021, nephew's tuition when Adrian couldn't swing it, $2,500. I scrolled and scrolled, each line a bruise I had forgotten I carried. My chest ached, but I couldn't stop. Finally, I reached the bottom and typed a new entry. 2025, Adrian's wedding expenses unauthorised, $99,000. In the notes column, I typed, not family, just obligation. Then I paused, deleted it, and instead wrote, they can't see what they've taken, but I do. The words glared back at me, colder than any number. I printed the whole thing. 40 pages, single-spaced, stapled in the corner. No colour, no highlighting, just raw data, facts, evidence. I stacked the papers neatly, my hands trembling, the sound of the printer echoing through the apartment. When it was done, I held the heavy stack in my hands. It wasn't just paper. It was years of silence turned into proof. Proof that I wasn't crazy, that my exhaustion wasn't weakness, that the erosion of my life had been real. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own story. I felt like a witness. The following Saturday, I drove to my parents' house with the 40-page stack resting in a manila folder on the passenger seat. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, but my resolve was steady. This time, I wasn't arriving as the quiet daughter, the agreeable child. I was arriving as a witness. Lorraine opened the door with a smile too wide, as if she'd been rehearsing it. Well, look who decided to drop in. You want iced tea, baby? I stepped past her without answering and set the folder on the dining table. Peter looked up from his newspaper, frowning. What's all that? It's not a fight, I said evenly. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to show you what I've survived. I slid the first few pages toward them. Lorraine laughed nervously. Survived? Sienna, honey, are you all right? I'm fine, I said. That's why I printed this. Peter picked up a sheet, scanned a few lines, then shook his head. We all have memories, Sienna. Yours just seem bitter. They're not memories, I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. They're records. There's a difference. Lorraine crossed her arms. This is ridiculous. You're digging up old wounds. No, I said, I'm showing you the cuts I've been bleeding from for years, while you were busy putting band-aids on Adrian's ego. She sat down hard, lips pressed thin. Peter muttered something about me being too sensitive. I realised then there would be no acknowledgement, no apology. They would rather call me dramatic than admit the truth staring at them in black and white. By the time I left, the folder still lay unopened on the table, pages scattered but unread. 2 nights later, Adrian texted, "Hey, can we talk?" Man to man. Or sister to brother, I guess. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a bar off Westheimer, one of those places with dim lighting and polished marble counters designed for men who wanted to look important. Adrian showed up in a blazer, no tie, hair slicked back like he was hosting a TED talk. He clapped me on the shoulder like we were teammates instead of adversaries. "Thanks for meeting," he said brightly, ordering us beers before I could speak. He launched into a monologue about wedding stress, how things had gotten complicated, how Mum and Dad didn't always handle things the right way. "But I know," he said, tilting his head as if confiding in me, "I know you've carried more than your share. It's not lost on me. I studied his face, searching for sincerity, but all I saw was strategy. "I'm trying to fix things," he continued. "I want you involved, not just in the wedding, but in what's next." "What's next?" I asked flatly. His grin widened. "Business, real estate, a boutique firm. Investors love the family angle. Solid name, trusted history. And yours, technically." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean, mine?" He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Coldstone Properties, LLC. It's already filed, under your social security number. Gives us credibility. You know how it works." I froze, beer glass untouched in my hand. "You used my SSN?" He smiled like it was no big deal. "Come on, it's family, just paperwork. We'll fix it later." My chest burned. I forced the words out slowly. "You forged my signature?" Adrian's eyes flicked away for a moment before settling back on me. "Digital signature, yeah, it routed through Tess's Wi-Fi, but don't worry, it's airtight. No one's looking." The bar suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. The weight of his words settled like lead. My brother hadn't just stolen my card, he had stolen my identity. And Tess, perfect, smiling Tess, had opened her door and her network to help him do it. I set my glass down carefully, afraid that if I moved too quickly, I'd shatter it. "You used my name," I said, each syllable deliberate. Adrian clapped me on the shoulder again, oblivious. "It's family, Sienna. That's what family does." I stood without another word, the 40 pages burning a hole in my memory. He thought my silence was consent. He thought my history of compliance guaranteed my future. But he was wrong. I spent the next morning in the quiet lobby of a law office, fingers wrapped tightly around a folder of documents. The receptionist's heels clicked across the tile as she led me back, where a woman in her early 40s greeted me with a firm handshake. "Tara Nguyen," she said. Her grip was steady, her gaze direct. She listened as I explained everything, my card used for the wedding, the 99,000, the bank emails, and finally Adrian's confession about Coldstone Properties. I slid the folder across the table. Tara scanned the pages, nodding slowly. "This isn't just messy family business," she said at last. "It's identity theft. They've committed fraud in your name." Hearing it spoken plainly was both terrifying and oddly validating. My chest tightened as Tara began typing. "We'll start with a cease and desist. It won't undo what's happened, but it puts them on notice. It draws the line." I signed the letter she drafted, the pen heavy in my hand. My name, for once, was there by my choice. That evening I drove to Adrian's condo. Tess answered the door in silk loungewear, her hair perfectly arranged as though she'd been waiting for an audience. "Oh," she said flatly, her gaze drifting to the envelope in my hand. "What's this?" "A cease and desist," I replied. My voice was calm, measured. "You'll want to read it." She smirked, tilting her head. "Sienna, you take yourself too seriously. You've always been dramatic." She let the word hang in the air like a blade. "I'm serious," I said, placing the envelope firmly in her hand. Her expression shifted only slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. Then she smiled, that smug, practiced smile. "Yeah, you've never been important in this family, you know. Not really. You're just the one who cleans up. Adrian builds. You patch." Her tone was casual, cruel in its effortlessness. I didn't argue. I just stepped back, turned, and walked away. But her words clung to me all night, echoing through the walls of my apartment. Not important, just the one who cleans up. I had spent my life swallowing that narrative, bending myself into its shape. But now, with Tara's letter signed and sealed, I knew there was another story. The next morning I walked into the glass atrium of my office building, the air-conditioned chill biting against my skin. My co-workers milled around with coffees, laptops, chatter. I was halfway to my desk when I heard it. "Sienna!" My father's voice. I froze. He stood in the centre of the lobby, red-faced, fists clenched, his voice booming as though he were in his own living room. "You had the nerve to send lawyers after your own family," he bellowed. Heads turned instantly. Conversations stopped. Clients waiting near the reception desk stared. I took a slow step forward, pulse pounding. "Dad, this isn't the place." "You owe us." His voice cracked, raw with rage. "Everything you have? We gave you. We fed you, clothed you, raised you, and this is how you repay us, with threats, with betrayal?" Whispers rippled across the lobby. My co-workers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between us. I kept my voice steady, though my hands trembled. "You stole from me. You used my name, my credit, my life." Peter jabbed a finger toward me, his face flushed. "You'll never be free of us, Sienna. You owe us until the day you die." Security appeared, their voices low and careful, but my father ignored them. He shouted louder, spittle catching in the light. "You were nothing without us. Nothing. Don't you dare act like you're better than this family. You are this family's debt, and you always will be." The words reverberated through the atrium. My co-workers stared at the floor, some horrified, some pitying. I met his eyes, and for the first time, I didn't feel like the child he wanted me to be. I didn't shrink. My voice was calm, even cold. "You didn't raise a daughter," I said. "You raised a shield." Security guided him toward the door, his curses trailing off as the glass closed behind him. The lobby buzzed again, conversations restarting, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavy. My father had declared my debt to the world, but in doing so, he revealed the truth. I was never their child. I was their collateral. That evening, I drove back to the old house, the one I had called home for most of my life. The street was familiar, the creak of the porch steps still timed with my breath. I stood at the door, the same door I had opened thousands of times as a daughter, and held the key in my palm. Cold metal, worn smooth from decades of use. I didn't knock. Through the window I saw Lorraine humming at the stove, Peter in his armchair, Adrian's laughter floating from the living room as if nothing had ever fractured. They were intact, together, the family they had always wanted to present to the world. And me, I was only the missing piece they never noticed was gone. I crouched down, set the key carefully on the welcome mat, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the door. My throat tightened, but I whispered anyway. This house never had a room for me. I just didn't see it. Then I stood, turned, and walked away without looking back. Back in my apartment, the silence was absolute. I cleared my desk, set my laptop down, and opened a blank document. If they wanted to call me dramatic, fine. I would be thorough instead. I began to create a timeline, emails from Magnolia Ridge, IP traces from Coldstone's digital filings, screenshots of every fraudulent charge. Hours passed unnoticed as I pieced the puzzle together. The glow of the screen lit the room like a sterile lamp in an interrogation chamber. Line by line, I built the case, not for them, not even for the courts yet, but for myself. Proof that I wasn't paranoid. Proof that this wasn't just family tension, it was systemic exploitation. At some point after midnight, exhaustion blurred my eyes. I leaned back, rubbing my temples, but curiosity tugged at me. If they had been willing to open a company in my name, what else had they touched? I logged into my online banking again, combing through older records. That's when I saw it. A recurring charge I had never noticed before. Small, almost invisible among the larger expenses. Insurance premiums, monthly, stretching back years. The policy number looked unfamiliar, so I traced it further, pulling statements, clicking through archived PDFs. When the details loaded, I froze. Beneficiary, Adrian Cole. Policyholder, Lorraine and Peter Cole. Payment method, Visa card ending in my digits. I sat back, bile rising in my throat. They had been paying their life insurance premiums with my card. Quietly, automatically, for years, and if anything happened to them, Adrian, the golden son, would collect. The realization cracked something deep inside me. It wasn't just the wedding. It wasn't just Cole Stone. It wasn't even the years of bills and favours. It was everything. My name had been currency in their household, traded and spent without consent, while Adrian reaped the benefits. I scrolled further, seeing payment confirmations stacked neatly, each one a record of how invisible I had been. They hadn't even told me. They hadn't even asked. The betrayal pressed down on me until I couldn't breathe. My parents had insured their lives by bleeding mine. I closed the laptop slowly, the hinge clicking shut like a coffin lid. My apartment was silent, but the silence didn't comfort me. It suffocated. For years I had told myself their choices came from love, however twisted. That I was helping, supporting, fulfilling my role as daughter. But tonight I saw the truth with brutal clarity. Love had never been the currency. Utility was. The key I had left on the welcome mat was more than metal. It was an obituary. Not for me, but for the illusion I had clung to all my life. I sat there in the dark, the glow of betrayal still burning in my chest, and realized there was nothing left to salvage. 3 days after I left the key on the mat, an envelope arrived at my apartment. The return address made my stomach clench before I even opened it. The law firm my parents had used years ago for estate planning. My hands shook as I slid a finger under the seal. Inside was a neatly typed letter on heavy stock paper. The words blurred at first, but as I forced myself to read, the message became clear. I was being accused of defamation. False and injurious statements that have caused reputational harm. They threatened legal action if I didn't cease disparaging the Cole family name. I laughed once, bitter and hollow. Defamation. They had drained my accounts, forged my identity, screamed at me in public, and now I was the abuser. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was intimidation, polished with letterhead. A warning meant to keep me quiet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the apartment until the floor creaked beneath me. Every shadow in the room felt like it was leaning closer, every tick of the clock louder. Sometime around 3 a.m, I collapsed on the couch, exhaustion finally swallowing me. That's when the dream came. I was 14 again. Adrian had taken the family car without permission, drunk and reckless. He swerved into a mailbox, crushing the bumper. The red and blue lights flashed in the distance, sirens cutting through the night. When the police arrived, Adrian sat trembling in the passenger seat, his eyes wide and wet. But when the officer asked who had been driving, it wasn't Adrian who spoke. It was me. It was me, I heard myself say, my voice small, breaking. My father didn't correct me. My mother didn't protest. They stood behind me, silent, letting the lie settle into the report. I was the one taken aside, the one warned, the one whose name went on the paper. Adrian was ushered back inside like nothing had happened. The dream ended with the cop's flashlight glaring in my face, blinding me as if demanding to know why I had volunteered for the punishment. I woke gasping, heart racing, sweat soaking my shirt. The panic sat heavy in my chest. Even in sleep, my body remembered I had been their shield long before I understood the cost. I staggered to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. My reflection in the window looked hollow, a ghost lit by the street lamps outside. The intimidation letter sat on the table where I had left it, crisp and smug in its envelope. I wanted to rip it up, to set it on fire. Instead, I stared at it until another memory bubbled up, one I hadn't thought of in years. It was my 16th birthday. I'd come home from school to a quiet house, no cake, no card, no celebration. I waited, telling myself maybe they had planned a surprise later, but the evening passed in silence. The next day, Lorraine appeared with a grocery store sheet cake. She set it on the counter with a flourish, as if she'd remembered just in time. The icing read, "Happy Birthday, Adrian." When I pointed it out, she clucked her tongue and said they must have gotten the order mixed up. She laughed it off, sliced the cake, and handed me a piece with Adrian's name piped in blue frosting. I had eaten it, swallowing around the lump in my throat, telling myself it didn't matter. But it did. It mattered more than I'd allowed myself to admit. Now, at 40, the memory slammed into me like a blow. The letter on the table wasn't an anomaly. It was the same story told again. Their mistakes were mine to absorb, their negligence my duty to excuse. I picked up the envelope, feeling the sharp edge bite into my palm. They weren't just trying to silence me now. They were rewriting me, painting me as the aggressor, the traitor. Just like when I was a teenager taking the fall, or a forgotten daughter eating someone else's birthday cake. My chest rose and fell in jagged breaths. The rage was real, but so was the clarity. This wasn't love. It had never been love. By sunrise, I was done pacing. I showered, dressed, and drove downtown with a folder tucked under my arm. The Harris County Records Building looked dull from the outside. Government beige, the kind of place most people walk past without noticing. But inside, it stored the bones of people's lives, deeds, wills, businesses, built and broken. At the clerk's counter, I gave my name, showed my ID, and asked to pull filings for Coldstone Properties, LLC. The woman behind the glass tapped her keyboard, then disappeared into a back room. 20 minutes later, she returned with a thin stack of papers. I sat at a plastic table under fluorescent light and spread the documents out. My chest tightened as I scanned the pages. The company had been registered under my social security number, just as Adrian had admitted. My name filled every line: registered agent, mailing address, taxpayer ID. Then I saw it, my digital signature at the bottom. Perfect cursive, my name reproduced as if I had signed it myself, but I hadn't. The metadata noted the signature originated from an IP address linked to Adrian's condo. More specifically, Tess's Wi-Fi account. My hand shook as I flipped through the pages. The forgery was bold, careless, arrogant. They hadn't even bothered to mask it. I copied every page, stapled them neatly, and slid them back across the counter. The originals weren't mine to keep, but the evidence was burned into my folder now. By noon, I was back at my desk, typing furiously. I filled out Form 3949A for the IRS, reporting suspected tax fraud. I filed a complaint with the FTC for identity theft. Each click of the mouse felt like driving a nail into a coffin that had been waiting years to close. But I didn't stop there. I compiled the documents into a packet, stripped out identifying information that would expose me directly. and uploaded it anonymously to Bayou Watch, a local investigative blog known for tearing open white-collar corruption. I didn't add a note, didn't beg for attention. The documents would speak for themselves. I leaned back, drained, my apartment humming with the weight of it. For the first time, I wasn't just absorbing, I was striking back. And then, as I combed through the filings one last time, I found it. Buried in the back of the packet was a loan agreement. Coldstone Properties had secured a line of credit from a bank, $200,000, backed by my name, my credit, my identity. My stomach dropped. This wasn't about a wedding. It wasn't even about a company. It was about expansion, a long con. Adrian hadn't just used me to throw a party. He had used me to build his empire. And Tess had opened the door for him, literally, her internet connection, tying the fraud back to her home. The air in the room turned thin, each breath a struggle. $200,000, signed and approved under my name without my knowledge. I saw the trap clearly now. If they defaulted, the debt would land on me. My life, my savings, my future gone. The fury that rose inside me wasn't hot, it was cold, precise. My chest no longer ached with grief, it burned with clarity. They had taken everything that because I had let them, and now finally I wasn't letting them anymore. I stacked the papers in a fresh folder, labelled it simply case file. When I closed the laptop, I felt lighter and heavier, all at once. Light because I had acted. Heavy because the scope of their betrayal was wider than I had ever imagined. Fraud with a hug, Riley had called it. She'd been right. But this wasn't just a hug anymore. This was strangulation. And I was done being suffocated. The day of the wedding arrived bright and sweltering, Houston's sun beating down on Magnolia Ridge Estate. Cars lined the gravel drive, polished black sedans and SUVs, each one delivering guests in pressed suits and pastel dresses. Inside, white chairs gleamed under an archway dripping with roses, violinists tuning their strings, the kind of spectacle built to impress, but I wasn't there. 3 miles away, I sat in a corner booth of a quiet cafe, a cup of coffee cooling in front of me. The place was nearly empty, the hum of the espresso machine drowning out my thoughts. From my bag, I pulled a thick envelope, sealed neatly and marked in my handwriting. To whoever calls me, ungrateful. Inside was a meticulous packet. Itemised credit card statements with charges highlighted, screenshots of the fraudulent LLC filings, and a stamped copy of the IRS complaint. I hadn't added commentary or accusations, just receipts, cold, undeniable proof. At 11:45 a.m., and I handed the envelope to a courier with instructions to deliver it to Lorraine Cole at Magnolia Ridge just before the ceremony began. He didn't ask questions, just nodded, slipped the package into his satchel, and walked out into the sun. By noon, the ceremony was underway. Guests settled into white chairs, fans fluttering in the heat. The pianist began to play a delicate prelude. Lorraine beamed, Tess adjusted her veil, and Adrian stood at the altar like a man who had already won. When the courier entered, no one noticed at first. He moved discreetly, handed the sealed envelope to Lorraine, and left. She accepted it with the same absent-minded grace she gave to flower arrangements. But then she saw my handwriting. Her smile faltered. She tore it open, pulling out the pages. The cheerful music floated around her as her eyes moved down the statements. Her face drained of colour. The corners of her mouth twitched, as if she were about to speak, but couldn't. The guests shifted, whispering. A woman leaned toward her neighbour. "What is it?" Lorraine didn't answer. She clutched the papers tighter, flipping page after page. The pianist stumbled over a chord. the wrong note breaking through the air like a crack in glass. He recovered quickly, but the moment had already shifted. Something was wrong and everyone felt it. At the altar, Adrian glanced over, frowning. "Mum?" His voice carried faintly through the microphone. Lorraine didn't respond. She just held the papers, her hand shaking. Then a phone buzzed. Adrian's pocket lit up, vibrating insistently. He ignored it at first, forcing a smile at Tess, but the buzzing didn't stop. Finally, he pulled the phone out, glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened. He stepped away from the altar, muttering an apology to the officiant. Tess blinked, confused, as Adrian answered the call. His voice dropped low, urgent, and then his face paled. From my booth at the cafe, I refreshed the Bayou Watch blog on my laptop. At the top of the page, a new headline glared back at me. Anonymous documents reveal fraudulent LLC registered under stolen identity. The article outlined everything: the stolen SSN, the falsified signature, the $200,000 loan. Names hadn't been printed yet, but insiders would piece it together quickly, especially the bankers. Back at Magnolia Ridge, Adrian shoved his phone back into his pocket and stalked off toward the side of the estate, his jaw clenched. Guests whispered louder now, heads craning, murmurs running like current through the crowd. Lorraine stood frozen, clutching the evidence I had sent. Tess's eyes darted from Adrian to the guests, her smile plastered too wide. The pianist fumbled again, hands trembling on the keys. The perfect facade had cracked, and no amount of roses could cover the fracture. I lifted my coffee, took a slow sip, and set the cup down. I didn't smile, didn't gloat. I simply watched the ripple spread, the silence between the whispers saying more than words ever could. For the first time, they were the ones scrambling, not me. By 12:30, the whispers had grown into a steady murmur that no amount of polite smiles could suppress. Guests leaned into one another, eyes darting toward Lorraine, still clutching the packet of papers. The once proud mother of the groom now sat rigid, her hands trembling. For the first time in my life, I saw her speechless. Lorraine Cole, the woman who always had a justification, an excuse, a story, couldn't summon a single word. People began to rise quietly from their chairs. At first, just a few, then more. Purses slung over shoulders, jackets slipped on, feet shuffling across the gravel paths. By the time the officiant cleared his throat to regain order, nearly half the seats were empty. And then, as if on cue, the Bayou Watch article began circulating from phone to phone. The headline blared on glowing screens. LLC fraud rocks Houston family wedding. Anonymous documents tied to identity theft, fraudulent loans, stolen credit. No names yet, but the guests didn't need names. They connected the dots. Tess's face drained of colour as she read over someone's shoulder. She looked at Adrian, her lips trembling in a half smile, half grimace. But he was already on his phone, barking into it, his jaw tight. Reporters must have caught wind. He cursed under his breath, glancing toward the entrance as though expecting cameras to materialize. Lorraine, still frozen, clutched the papers tighter, her knuckles blanched. For once she didn't scold, didn't explain, didn't tell anyone what family really meant. She just stared at the black and white proof of what they had done, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Peter stood beside her, his face set like stone, but even he avoided looking at the pages. And Tess, perfect Tess, in her flawless white gown, suddenly bolted. She didn't announce it, didn't excuse herself. She just lifted the hem of her dress and ran, her heels clattering across the stone walkway, veil catching on a chair as she pushed past the stunned guests. "Wait!" Adrian shouted, reaching after her, but Tess didn't turn. Her veil tore free, fluttering to the ground as she disappeared into the parking lot. The guests gasped, then fell into hushed chatter, some already pulling out phones to record, to gossip, to spread the spectacle further. Adrian stood at the altar alone, abandoned in the very spotlight he had stolen from me my entire life. Alone with his crumbling empire and a half-empty room. From my booth at the cafe, I refreshed the blog again. The article now had an update. Insiders confirm the fraudulent LLC tied directly to the groom's residence. The words pulsed against the screen, sealing his fate in digital ink. I sat back, the hum of the espresso machine steady in my ears. The chaos at Magnolia Ridge played out on my laptop, but I didn't need to see every detail. I could feel the collapse from miles away. On the table sat a paper napkin from the cafe's dispenser. I picked it up, folding it corner to corner, then again, my fingers moving automatically. When I was a child, Lorraine used to fold my doodles into little origami leaves, telling me I always made things beautiful quietly. For years, I mistook that for love. Now, with deliberate patience, I shaped the napkin into a small, uneven leaf. I placed it gently on the table, smoothing the crease. It wasn't triumph I felt. It wasn't revenge. It was release. I left the folded leaf behind on the booth's wooden surface, slid a few bills under my cup, and walked out into the humid afternoon. The cafe door closed softly behind me. Somewhere across town, the wedding had unravelled, the guests were scattering, the bride had fled, and Adrian stood alone in the ruins of his perfect day. And me? I didn't need to be there to witness it. I had already let go. The weeks after the wedding passed in an unsettling quiet. No knocks on my door, no angry calls, no letters slipped under the mat. Not from Lorraine, not from Peter, not even from Adrian. At first, the silence unnerved me, like the pause before an aftershock. But as the days stretched into a month, I realised it wasn't hesitation, it was indifference. They weren't coming because they didn't want me. They never had. I had been a function, not a daughter, a shield, not a sister, and now that I had stepped out of my role, they had no use for me. That truth, sharp as it was, settled like a strange balm. One morning I drove downtown, papers in hand, to the courthouse. The process was surprisingly simple. A stack of forms, a fee, a notary stamp. By noon, I was no longer Sienna Cole. On the official record, I became Sienna Vale. The clerk slid the stamped documents across the counter, and for a moment my throat closed. The name felt light, unburdened, like a coat I could finally choose for myself. It wasn't an escape, it was reclamation. For the first time in 40 years, my identity belonged to me. Later that week, I sat across from Dr. Ames, a therapist I had started seeing at Tara's recommendation. The office smelled faintly of lavender, the blinds drawn against the sharp Texas sun. "So," she said gently, pen resting on her notepad. "How are you today, Ms. Vale?" The name startled me in its newness, but it also rooted me. "Strange," I admitted, "like I've been walking in someone else's shoes and suddenly they're mine." She smiled. "And how do those shoes feel?" I let out a breath, fiddling with the edge of my sleeve. "Right, but heavy." Dr. Ames tilted her head. "What's the heaviest part?" I hesitated, then said the words I had never dared to voice. Knowing I did everything right, and it was still never enough for them. The silence that followed wasn't cruel or dismissive. It was steady, holding me like a net. Dr. Ames didn't rush to fill it. She simply nodded, letting the weight of my truth settle. Finally, she said, "Enough for them is not the same as enough for you. Whose standard matters more now? I swallowed hard, the answer coming softer than I expected. Mine. That word lingered in the air, simple but revolutionary. When I left her office, the world looked the same. Cars rushing down the freeway, people hunched over phones, the Texas heat pressing down. But inside me, something had shifted. A small crack of space where suffocation used to be. That evening, I made tea and sat by the window. The silence in my apartment felt different now, not empty but chosen. I opened my laptop, scanning through the day's headlines, when one caught my eye. Coldstone Properties dissolved amid fraud investigation. My heart stuttered. I clicked the article. The words scrolled across the screen. The fraudulent LLC had been officially dissolved, assets frozen, an IRS audit pending. And then the line that made me sit straighter. Adrian Cole under investigation for wire fraud and identity theft. Twist 13. The golden son, the miracle child, the one they'd built their world around, was finally facing the consequences. His face, once plastered with charm, now flashed in blurry photos outside a courthouse, reporters shouting questions he couldn't answer. I stared at the screen, my tea cooling beside me. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was clarity. They had always believed I would carry the burden for him. But this time he carried it alone. I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and whispered my new name softly into the quiet room. Sienna Vale. It didn't erase the years. It didn't fix the scars. But it was mine. And for the first time, that was enough. A week after the news of Coldstone's dissolution broke, I found myself wandering through downtown on a Saturday afternoon. The sky was washed in pale blue, the air heavy with summer warmth. As I turned a corner, the sound of laughter and music drifted across the street. Another wedding. I paused at the edge of the sidewalk, just far enough to see but not be seen. The church doors were thrown open, sunlight spilling across the steps where guests gathered, their voices bright with celebration. The bride, radiant in lace, stood under an arch of flowers, children in miniature suits darting around her legs. I watched, but there was no bitterness rising in me, no jealousy gnawing at my chest. I didn't feel the ache of exclusion. Instead, I felt distance, clean, measured. Like I was standing on the shore of a life that had never been mine, observing waves I no longer needed to wade into. For years, I would have told myself that I wanted this. The applause, the recognition, the belonging. But as I stood there, nameless in the crowd, I realized what I wanted had never been their version of family. What I wanted was freedom. A burst of laughter cut through the air as a little girl in a white dress ran past me, spinning wildly, her hands clutching something folded from paper. She stopped abruptly in front of me, eyes wide, cheeks flushed pink. Without a word, she extended the object toward me. I took it gently, a folded leaf crafted from a napkin. My breath caught. For a moment, I was a child. Again. Watching Lorraine fold my doodles into paper leaves, telling me I made things beautiful quietly. Back then, I had mistaken that ritual for love. Now, looking down at the uneven creases, I saw it differently. This wasn't love borrowed from someone else. It was a reminder that beauty could come from my own hands. The little girl giggled, then dashed off to join her friends, leaving me with the fragile leaf balanced in my palm. I held it for a long moment, then opened my fingers. The breeze caught it instantly, carrying it down the sidewalk, over the grass, past the church steps. I didn't chase it. I didn't need to. As the laughter of strangers swirled around me, I slipped my hand into my purse and pulled out my wallet. Inside, tucked behind my ID, was a slip of paper I had carried for years. The edges were worn, the ink faded, but the words still visible: "Good girls bleed for liars." It had been my mother's mantra, etched into me the first time I sacrificed something I wanted so Adrian could have more. It had followed me through birthdays, graduations, debts. For years, it had defined me. I took out a pen, laid the paper against the wall beside me, and drew a single line through the phrase. My hand shook, but I pressed harder, carving the ink deep across the words. Beneath it, I wrote slowly, carefully, "Good women choose themselves." I stared at the sentence until the letters blurred, until the truth of it settled deep into my chest. Folding the paper, I slid it back into my wallet, not as a burden, but as a declaration. A record of the moment I finally rewrote the story. The music swelled from the church. Another cheer rising as vows were sealed. I turned away, walking down the street, the sounds fading behind me. There was no triumph in my steps, no fanfare, no cinematic ending. Just stillness. The steady rhythm of my own breath unbroken, unclaimed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying their debt, their shame, their weight. I was carrying only myself. And that, at last, was enough.